Zelden has been working on teaching the Inferno to a group of people. A couple of classes in, gotten to the circle, the seventh circle, where the circle of doing violence to yourself, violence to God, heretics, and violence enacted upon other people. And it's been, the whole process has been helping me to cook and to think through ideas. And one thing I want to talk about is philosophers and their pupils, teacher and student relationship in Inferno. The most famous is Virgil and Dante, right? That is the most obvious one. But I can see a different set of student-pupil relationships. The first of it is Aristotle and Alexander. The second is Chiron, the Centaur, and Achilles. And how the two teachers, Chiron and Aristotle, are treated in the book is different, and what happens to the pupils is different. So let's dive into that and see what we can kind of come up with, because I think there's a bracketing effect in this, which is juxtaposing these men and these teachers. So, what type of education did Aristotle give Alexander? Well, when Alexander was 13, Plutarch tells us that his father, Philip of Macedon, looked for a teacher, a philosopher, because he wanted to educate his young son to be a king, and he picked Aristotle. And part of Aristotle's conditions of getting a contract to teach the young man was to have his city rebuilt, Stagira, and all the people that Philip of Macedon had sold into slavery were bought back by Philip, and they were all liberated and the city was rebuilt. So that was a pretty cool contract term that Aristotle negotiated for his fellow citizens, and I hope they were pretty happy about that. So when Aristotle, one of the preeminent philosophers, was teaching Alexander, what he taught him was philosophy, morals, religion, logic, and art. And Plutarch tells us in the life of Alexander that Alexander developed a great interest in the Iliad and in the heroic myths, and he carried a book that he had been given, or should I say a scroll, that he had been given by Aristotle for the rest of his life when he went on campaign. And he was a very educated man. He could quote Euripides from memory. So clearly Alexander was a very capable individual. Now, what we know is that some of the elements of education went beyond what this kind of standard education, because Plutarch says that Aristotle also taught him the principles of philosophy and ethics and politics, but also the more esoteric studies of philosophy, and that later Alexander said that Philip, his king, gave him life, but it was Aristotle who taught him how to live well. Now, over the course of years, they began to separate a small bit, and Alexander went his own way, and in the end, Aristotle goes through Athens and ends up ultimately in Stagira at the end of his life, full circle. So, in terms of the Inferno, where do we see Alexander? Alexander is in the seventh circle. It's the violence against others circles. This is where the river Phlegethon, the river of blood, holds those who have been bloody tyrants and war makers, imposing death and violence upon other people. Now, in the poem, he's simply called Alexander, but it has always been understood that this must mean Alexander the Great. Some have thought that there's a different Alexander, but that's kind of regarded as a bit more just looking for variation rather than actually likely to be the case. A question for me is that why is Alexander ended up in the seventh circle of hell? Again, I'm going to go back to Plutarch, but why I have this question is Caesar is in limbo, and I'm a Celt, right? So my ancestors in Gaul were treated very roughly and rudely by Caesar, tens and tens of thousands of them being killed, right? So So that was violence to others. I mean, the Gallic Wars runs red on every second page. Yet he ends up in limbo. But Alexander ends up in the River Phlegethon. And I think part of why he does is because how Alexander is shows something about what Aristotle the philosopher tried to teach people to live. And in how he lived his life, Alexander, he has disproved the theories, or failed, I should say, the theories of Aristotle. Now I want to dive into that. I'm going to use Plutarch. So Alexander was a famous general, campaigner, incisive, spontaneous, a real soldier, an adventurer's adventurer, right? But he has an aspect of his personality which is going to come into conflict with how Aristotle proposed that people should live. And Plutarch tells us about how Alexander behaved in the city of Persepolis, which was the capital of Babylon. He has just conquered this empire. The Greeks have finally overthrown the mighty Persian Empire, their arch nemesis in all of history, right? They have won a massive victory. And at a party, a courtesan, which is a fancy word for the oldest trade in the world, encourages Alexander to burn down the palace of Xerxes. And Alexander is drunk. And in his excitement, in his passions, he loses control of himself. He's an impulsive character, and he takes a torch and they go to the palace, right? But he manages to restrain himself. But this is only after he has lost all control and engaged in a type of violence. And Plutarch continues to have multiple stories where he recounts how, in fits of rage, Alexander kills various friends. Some he thinks were plotting against them, and he gets so cross that he kills them. And one other said, something wrong to him, and again, the trigger temper goes off the handle, and he kills his friend. So there's a type of looseness about how Aristotle lives his life. It's an impulsiveness, right? And it kind of can be understood if we look at who Aristotle is in hell with. He is right beside Dionysius of Sicily, who was a brutal ruler who, once the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta is over, and the power of Carthage is expanding into Sicily, Dionysius is the type of guy who tries to carve out his own personal space, his own personal kingdom in this chaos, and using mercenaries imposes a dictatorial rule on the people of Syracuse, and carves out this kingdom in Sicily. And it's a very brutal and bloody time. And I think that tells an awful lot about what type of way Dante is looking at Alexander, because Dionysius in Plutarch is described as in a pretty cool way as a strategos autocrator. He is a strategos, a general, and he's an autocrator, which is like self-power. He's been described as like a military dictator and commander-in-chief, right? He's the classical notion of what we regarded as a dictator in our modern time. So Alexander is being put into the worst of company, the type of people who are brutal to those who they should carefully be ruling. And that, of course, is what has failed. Alexander has failed to be good to the people of Persepolis, having conquered them. He has failed those who were his friends throughout the campaign when he loses his cool in drunken fits, or when he loses his cool because he can't manage his temper, right? And he kills these people. Now, this is the opposite of what Aristotle would have taught him. Aristotle, in the Nicomachean Ethics, talks about 11 virtues, and one of the virtues is the handling of anger. Aristotle describes that you have a scenario where there's a golden mean, and there's excess, and then there's there's carefully managing it, and there's the excess, and in the middle that's where you want to be. That's why it's called the golden mean. one of the famous ones that's used to describe this is courage, right? If you're too courageous, as Alexander was as a man, he was indeed reckless, then you're actually maybe foolhardy, right? You're not brave, you're simply blind to that which is going around you. Maybe that is an excess of courage. And on the other side, you have the alternative, which is that you're too terrified to do anything. And when the situation calls you to action, you're incapable of doing it. This is what we call a coward. So somewhere in the middle, you must have the wisdom to be able to know when to fight, and the wisdom to know when you are simply being foolish or running into fights. And as a man who is killing his friends, as a man who burns down a city in drunken rage, clearly Alexander is not managing himself well, even close to the golden mean, but is a man of excess and recklessness. And I think this is very conscious on Dante's part, because while looking into this, I noted in what little learning I've been able to do about it that Dante uses Aristotle's ethics as an underpinning of the order of hell. And what Dante does, what Aristotle does, I should say, is he chooses between sins that are voluntary and sins that are, he describes virtues and failings that are voluntary and involuntary. So an involuntary type of sin would be what we see with Francesca and her lover. They fall in love simply because the magic of the moment, the beauty of the literature, the capturing of this essence of romance, right? And they have types of failings, there's no doubt about it, but it is a type of involuntary sin, right? And this is a type of sin of what has been called incontinence, lust, gluttony, greed, right? Then there's the next sins, which are violence, and the worst of all, which is fraud and treachery, because violence is a type of mix between incontinence and malice, right? Because you can maybe lose control, but at the same time, it could reflect the darkness within you, the lack of your ability to control who you are, right? And then all the way down to the circles 8 and 9 of fraud and treachery, where the hypocrites are and the traitors are, right? These are the calculating people who sit down, think their way through it, and make their choices there. So Aristotle's ethics gives a structure to the logic of sin that is laid out in the Inferno, right? You're moving from nature, which is at the start, sins of lust and sins of greed, like a biological type of sin, right? And then you're moving down the line to sins of thought, sins of the rational mind, right? You have your natural being, right? And you should be able to control that to an extent. But in the bottom circle of hell, you have those people who have, don't even recognize anymore their natural being, but who are now solely calculating and deviant, and they have misused the power of rational thought that they have been given, perhaps as people. So this is something that that Dante gets from Aristotle, because Aristotle believed that people could be fundamentally people had a fundamental nature, and that they could be trained as philosophers. And what we see is that although Alexander was fundamentally from good stock as the son of a king, right? He was trained by a eminent philosopher in all of the noble arts, and he was quite an accomplished and capable student. And yet the base, reckless nature of Alexander does not get conquered, right? He can't overcome it. And it's for that reason, I believe, that he ends up in hell. And not only in hell, but in the seventh circle of hell, because he's a recklessly violent man who has failed the teachings of his preeminent philosopher. The man who knew everything compared to everybody else is pretty much what he is described by Dante in the canto in Limbo. Now, the other famous classical education reference in this is Chiron and Achilles, and Chiron is a centaur. And Chiron is famous for teaching Achilles, but not only has he taught Achilles, He has taught many other people. He taught Asclepius, the god of healing. He taught Jason, who wins the golden fleece, right? So Chiron is an epitome of a thing which is base and bestial, right? Because the centaurs are liminal beings in the Greek world. There's the core of humanity, Greeks, right? And then beyond that, there's that interface between wildness and civilization, and the centaurs represent that. So at their very essence, by nature, a centaur is a base and bestial thing. But Chiron is different. Chiron has taken learning, arts, philosophy, and he has used these things to transform his nature and to become something way beyond his initial form, way beyond his natural form. Just as Alexander started one way but couldn't escape it through the gaining of the arts, Chiron started at the bottom through the gaining of the arts, through reason, through learning, was able to transform himself. And he makes a positive contribution. He teaches Asclepius, the god of healing. He teaches Jason, who helps kind of create a type of order within the Eastern Mediterranean. And he teaches Achilles, the preeminent hero, the guiding light of the Iliad. Now, where is Achilles? If he is one of the guiding lights of the Iliad, what has happened to him? Achilles is in the second circle of hell. He's in the circle of lust, a bit like Francesca, but he's doing it for a different reason. Achilles is instead put there for lust, but it's a lust which could be also equated to a type of betrayal, because we have learned that from one of the later writings about Achilles, that Achilles, there's a tradition that Achilles goes and falls in love with Polyxena, who is the daughter of Priam and Hecuba, the Trojan king and queen. And out of lust or foolishness, he goes to meet Polyxena, and there's a trap, and he is killed. And it ends, unfortunately, for Polyxena as well. She dies on the tomb of Achilles. She is supposed to have maybe been killed either by the Greeks or by Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles. And this is a type of a sin of incontinence, right? The preeminent hero could not but want to go to visit Polyxena, and it could be regarded as a breach of trust to his Greek fellow soldiers, because he consorted with the enemy. So it verges on treason, but Dante has treated it as simply to do with lust. So that's why he gets put in the second thing. Now, what I think is interesting is that there's a kind of a contrast here between what happens to the pupils, right? We have a man who is well trained by one of the preeminent, which is Achilles, trained by the preeminent Chiron in the arts. And we have a man who, and he can't control himself, but he can control himself in a much better way than Alexander. And famously, the Iliad starts off by Alexander being restrained by Athena, who pulls his hair when he's about to draw the sword and to kill Agamemnon. So there's a type of spirit which is in Achilles of retaining and holding back, right? And when he fails, it is a type of foolish failure based on love, which leads to his downfall rather than to the burning of cities or to the torturing and imposition on innocent people. Now, as I said, the centaurs represented bestiality. They're famous in Greek mythology for going to the wedding of Pirithous, getting drunk and then trying to abduct the brides, and there you have Theseus and Heracles, and they all fight, and it's terrible, right? But who is not there is Chiron, because Chiron is educated. He is a philosopher, right? He is a man. He's a centaur who has been able to understand how to restrain and transform that bestial nature, to overcome it and to achieve a type of rational insight, exactly what Aristotle would have wanted. Okay, now there's a second dimension. Where is Chiron? Chiron is in the seventh circle of hell, but Chiron is not there because he is a sinner. Chiron is there as a type of guard, just as Aristotle is in the limbo, rewarded for the progression of his soul, the progression of his individuality from a base to a refined process. So too Chiron has a type of reward in the seventh circle, because Chiron is not being punished. Chiron is there as a soldier and a guide. Chiron is an instrument. And it seems to me that Chiron is not an instrument of hell, but is an instrument of Paradiso. Just as Paradiso is able to extend its influence through other parts of the infernal world, i.e. limbo, so too it is able to transform and maybe preserve the status of Chiron. And here's a thing where I think it gets even better, right? Chiron was a teacher of Asclepius. Asclepius is the god of healing in the Greek world. And what does a healer do? A healer provides succor and support, help from injury, help from wounds. That's what Chiron gave to the world. And now Chiron stands over the men who are in the river Phlegethon, and if they try to escape their suffering, then Chiron and his soldiers, his fellow centaurs, will shoot them with arrows. Once more, Chiron is the person, the embodiment of what it means to be giving to others, to be healing others, right? And in a way, that kind of he has topped Aristotle, right? He, as a baser thing, he must go lower down, and yet in a way he continues to have a type of positive engagement with the world. He continues to be a force for good in line with how he lived his life, and his pupil does much better because his pupil has failed less, whereas Alexander failed terribly. There's another feature that I want to bring your attention to. There's a type of chiasmus in this poem, in this particular teacher-pupil relationship. And a chiasmus in Greek and Latin literature is a bracketing effect. So you might have night, light, day, dark. Night, dark, light, day. You see this A, B, B, A effect, right? And for the Greeks and the Latins, this was a very pleasing effect when used with words, because it created sometimes a harmony of sounds, or it created a contrast of ideas. What we have here in Inferno is a chiasmus between the teacher and pupil. Okay, we have the human teacher, Aristotle, in limbo. We have the pupil of the centaur, Chiron, and that's Achilles. Achilles is stuck in limbo. So right beside the man, Aristotle, is the hero, Achilles. Then we have Alexander. Alexander is a man, a real man, not a mythical figure, and he is the pupil of Aristotle in the second canto. Then on the outermost edge, we have Chiron. Chiron is a centaur. Just like Aristotle, he is a philosopher. Two philosophers on the outside, two students on the inside. Aristotle, human, real. Chiron, not human, not real. We've got Achilles, human, not real. He's a mythological hero. We've got Alexander, real. Okay, so we've got these interesting brackets. We've got a contrast between the man, Aristotle. We've got a contrast between Chiron. Both of them are doing the exact same thing. They have got different students. Their students end up in different places. And I think that's a very interesting feature. And I don't think it's by chance, because as Cale has explained, poems are built for a reason. I think that's true, right? Because and it's a great idea to take note of, because when you hear that, when you register that, you are invited to think about why this particular way. Okay, and it means that there's a hint there. So it's keep on searching. I like that. There's one thing I want to wrap up with, which is a slight jump away from the theory, the idea I've been talking about in this video, which is to note that the centaur who is assigned the job of bringing them over is Nessus, right? And Nessus is a famous centaur in Greek mythology. And Nessus is instructed by Chiron. Nessus, who was, as far as I can recall, at the wedding of the Lapiths, at the wedding of Pirithous, who was involved in all the messy debauchery of getting drunk and trying to steal the bride, etc., is given a command by the wise and careful thinking Chiron the good. And he obeys, and he brings Dante across the river. Nessus is in Inferno. Nessus died because he chose to bring Deianira, the wife of Heracles, across a river. But Nessus did not do it to be a good centaur. Nessus did it because he thought Deianira was very beautiful, and that if she was on his back, then that was halfway to being able to take her and abduct her. Again, Nessus is a creature which is bestial and without control. Nessus is incontinent by nature, right? And he does that, but unluckily for him, a river of an arrow dipped in poisonous blood, the blood of the Stymphalian birds, right? This poisonous blood that Heracles has. He fires an arrow and it kills Nessus. Now Nessus has a cloth on his back, and he gives that cloth to Deianira, and it's covered in blood. And he says, look, Deianira, although I'm dying, I apologize for trying to kidnap you. I'm going to do you a really great turn, right? You're married to Hercules, you know, the Gigachad, right? The man who's got a famous roving eye. So if you find that at one day Heracles he's losing interest in you, and you want to rekindle that love that he now has for you, and to make sure it continues, you must take this cloth and you put it on him. And when he wears it, he will fall madly once more in love with you. And right, that's it. Okay, I'm dying here, you know, but at least I'm dying like a good man, right? But never believe what you're hearing from the wicked, because that cloth is covered in the blood of the dying Nessus, and in that blood is the poison of the Stymphalian birds, which will kill anything and everything that it touches. And many years later, Nessus gets his revenge on Heracles, because Deianira, thinking that Nessus is losing interest in her, puts on the cloth around Heracles, and as soon as it touches him, it begins to kill. He begins to die, and it's a terrible death that he has to go through. He ends up burning himself because he can't handle the pain. That's the way he transforms himself from man to God at the hand of Zeus. But what's a nice little flip on this is that it's blood. Nessus gets into Inferno because of this poisonous blood. And when Dante comes across to the Phlegathon, it is a river of blood, a river which I think we can say is poisonous blood, right? You know, it's got to be, surely. It's a place of infernal torture. And Nessus transforms Dante from one side over to the other. And he doesn't do so as an act of betrayal. He does so as an act, almost of redemptive act in nature. And I see in that the question, is this a moment where redemption is foreshadowed? Is Nessus an indication of that which was wicked on the outside, that which was bestial on the outside, has redemption? Is Chiron a flag which says that even though here in the seventh circle, that which was base can be redeemed? And I think Nessus points to that. So I'm going to be looking at that a bit more, and we'll see how that goes.